Hello, this is Miss Standridge. Happy Easter! Today is Easter, and I hope that you have been enjoying it, even though we may not have been able to have our traditional Easter celebrations with family. Hopefully, we've been able to enjoy the day. So, we're going to be reading another chapter in Elijah of Buxton. I just want to show you. Look at that. We have just a very little bit of the book left. So, let's go ahead and start reading chapter 17 and find out what Elijah is up to. Chapter 17, Bad News from a Little Village in America. Time don't never go so slow as when you're waiting on someone to bring you news. Word spread about Mr. Leroy being able to buy his family, and whilst him and me worked clearing Mrs. Holton's field, all sorts of folks came up to us and gave him their regards and good wishes. Mr. Leroy didn't work no slower nor no faster whilst we waited to hear from the preacher and Mr. Highgate. He just kept plugging away at the trees like he always did, making the same music, stopping every time someone came up, only long enough to see if they were going to tell him something. Once he saw they weren't, he was respectful but went right back at swinging that axe. After 4 days crawled by, talk started up about sending someone to that village in Michigan to see if there was a problem. Didn't no one own up to being worried, but everybody was. On the 5th day after the preacher and Mr. Highgate left, me and old Flapjack were rock fishing at our secret lake. I'd just chunked a good-sized perch and was pulling him in when old Flap gave one of them snorts, meaning someone was near. I quit concentrating on the perch and raised my head. I heard Cooter calling my name from far off. "Cooter, I'm down here." He ran up on me and waited a second for his breathing to catch up to him, then said, "They bringing Mr. Highgate in from Windsor on a wagon." "Bringing?" "Uh-huh. Some folk we don't know from Windsor got him loaded on a wagon." "How come he ain't riding Jingle Boy?" "I don't know, Eli. They say there's a horse tied up behind the wagon." "Where's he at now?" "They said he's 'bout half an hour outside Buxton, but that was afore I left to come find you." "What'd they say about Mr. Leroy's family?" "Didn't no one say nothin'. A rider just came by and brung the news that Mr. Highgate got hurt bad." I said, "What about—" Cooter read my mind. He said, "They said the preacher ain't with him." My heart sunk. That could only mean someone had robbed him and killed the preacher or snatched him into slavery. I knowed I should go find Mr. Leroy and let him know we got word. But after I thought on it for a second, it came to me that I didn't really have nothing to tell him. Ma's always saying, "Believe some to none of what you hear and only half of what you see." So I didn't think I should run to tell Mr. Leroy some bad news that I weren't sure had really happened. I told Cooter, "Come on, if we run down the road, maybe we can catch the wagon afore they get to Buxton." Cooter said, "You go on ahead, Eli. I've been hightailing all over these woods looking for you. I ain't got no more strength for running." "All right, you ride old Flap back, and I'm going to try to head off that wagon. Gather up my fishing things, and you can have 2 of those bass on the stringer. Take the rest to my ma." Soon as I broke out of the woods onto the road, I saw fresh wagon wheel marks. They must have already passed. I ran back into the trees to try and cut them off farther on down. Right after I turned the first bend, I could hear a wagon ahead, so I ran through the woods to where they were going to have to pass. It warn't but a minute later that I saw 2 horses pulling a big wagon with Jingle Boy tied up behind. I waved at 'em. The driver pulled the horses up and said, "You heading to Buxton, son?" "Yes, sir, but I'm looking for—" A hand gripped onto the stakes of the wagon bed. A man's head peeked over the side, and he said, "Elijah, that you?" I knowed it had to be Mr. Highgate, but at first I didn't recognize him. He said, "It's me, boy." My heart dropped down into my stomach. It was Mr. Highgate, and he didn't look nothing like the way he looked when he left 5 days ago. I felt my knees get all loose and floppity, like I was going to fall into a heap right next to the wagon. The driver reached down and pulled me up on the seat next to him. I looked back at Mr. Highgate. His left eye was open, but the right one was swole shut. There was a line running clean across his forehead that was so straight it looked like someone had took a measuring stick, then cut along it with a knife. The cut had gone bad and was bandaged up, but it still was leaking something from the sides. Mr. Highgate was kind of choking as he talked. He said, "He done shot me. He done shot me." He weren't saying it all riled up and worried or scared and mad like you'd expect someone that got shot would say it. He was saying it like it was a surprised little prayer. Like he was thinking if he said it over and over, he might get a hold on to what happened. "Elijah, he done shot me. He tried to take my head off." The driver said, He ain't been in his right mind the whole time. Keep on mumbling about someone named Zechariah." I climbed into the wagon's bed and put Mr. Highgate's head in my lap. We weren't but a mile outside Buxton when a bunch of grown folks came running at us. Pa was out front. "Pa!" Pa jumped into the wagon, looked at Mr. Highgate, and called to Mr. Seggy, "Clarence, ride on to Chatham and get the doctor. He been shot." Mr. Seggy ran toward Buxton. Pa said, "Theodore, what happened?" Mr. Highgate said, "Spencer, I done let Leroy down. I ain't done nothing to stop him. I tried. I swear I did, but he shot me." Pa said, "Talk slow, Theo. Tell me what happened." Mr. Highgate said, "Didn't nothing go right. We's cursed soon as we left Canada. Soon as we get on the ferry to Michigan, Zechariah start in acting peculiar. First thing he done is take that old pistol he showed you all out of his waistcoat and asked me if I wanted to hold on to it. You know I ain't real partial to no kind of pistol, Spencer, so I tells him no thanks, I got my shotgun. That's plenty enough for me. He say, 'Suit yourself,' and I'll be blamed if he don't toss that old pistol right into the Detroit River. I asked him how come he done that, and he say he don't need that one. He got him something better. Then he go in his saddlebag and pull out the exact same gun and holster like the one he give to Leroy for safekeeping. The exact same one. I knowed right then all them stories about him killing them white twins weren't gossip at all. It was gospel." Pa had a look on his face like someone told him he was about to get shot at sunrise. All he said was, "Oh." Mr. Highgate said, "Then once we get them horses unloaded off the ferry, he start in on acting like he don't know me. He won't say nothing to me. He carrying on like he don't hear none of the questions I's asking him. We just plod on up the road to this little logging village. I ain't feeling no danger. You know how strange he be some of the time. I just figure he ain't letting nothing pull him off getting up there to talk to that there white man. I's hoping against hope everything's still fine. Once we gets to that village, he tells me it's too late to go see this white man, that we gonna have to hold on till tomorrow. I still ain't sensing nothing wrong. We pull up in this alley, and I spread me a blanket and tries to get some rest. I has the hardest time getting to sleep, so I's just laying there with my eyes shut. A couple hours later, I seen Zeph is real quiet walking off, toting the bag with all Leroy's money and gold in it. I calls after him, and he tells me he knows where some gambling's going on, and he figured if Leroy's money could buy 3 people what was slaves, then he could gamble him up 2 times that sum and free 6 of 'em. It gives him a look like I ain't about to consider no nonsense such as that. Then he asks me if freeing 6 warn't better'n freeing 3. Mr. Highgate said, "Spencer, a chill run up my back." I told him, Zeph, ain't no one gonna gamble that money." He laughed and say, "Don't worry, ain't no gamble the way I play cards." I tells him, "As long as I's here, you ain't playing nothing." And I reach for my shotgun and aims it at his knee. He looks at me cold as a viper, like he don't believe I's serious. I tells him, "You gonna leave all that money and gold right here, else ain't both of us coming out this here alley the same way we come in." He laugh again and say, "You ain't got no idea how hard it is to kill a man." He say, "You ain't got the heart to shoot no one." And he pull that pistol out the holder and hold it down at his side. Mr. Highgate went on, "What could I do? I draws a bead right on his knee so's he can see I ain't fooling. All he do is stare me in my eye and start to raise that pistol. I can't think 'bout nothing but all them years Leroy done worked, and how if Zeph left with that gold we weren't never going to see him no more." Pa said, "Lord, today." Mr. Highgate said he was right. "I ain't never even point no gun at no man in my life, Spencer." Pa said, "Ain't no one gonna fault you for not shooting him, Theo." Mr. Highgate said, "It ain't like that. I tried. I steadies the shotgun, pulls the trigger, and—" Me and Pa quit breathing. Mr. Highgate said, "And don't nothing happen, just a loud click. I ain't never heard no sound so terrible in my whole life. I knowed I had that shotgun loaded, and just as quick I knowed some way he done unload it. I must have dozed off and didn't know it." He get a smile on his face what looked like death hisself, and raised that pistol till it aimin' dead twixt my eyes. I 'member thinking I done let Leroy down. I 'member thinking warn't no good at all in the world if this was going to happen, if this rapscallion was going to get away with this crime. I 'member thinking about my wife. Then I 'member getting lift off my feet, and I don't recall nothing else till a couple days pass. Once I come to, some free folks up in the logging town was tending to me. A man and his wife, mighty fine folk, took good care of me and didn't want nothing in return. Mr. Highgate fumbled in the top pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a piece of paper and said, "I axed 'em to write they name down so's I could send 'em some of my syrup as a kind of thank you. They even borrowed a wagon to carry me to Detroit, then set it up with this here man to bring me to Buxton." He handed me the paper. It had writ across it in rough letters, "Benjamin Alston, 509 Wilbur Place." Mr. Highgate's mind seemed to leave him. I tried handing him the paper back, but he pushed my hand away and said, "He shot me. He really done shot me." Pa said, "Hold on to it, Elijah." I folded the paper back up and put it in my pocket. Pa said, "Theodore, try to remember. You didn't hear nothing more on Zechariah?" Mr. Highgate said, "Mr. Alston say word was that Zeph be drinking and carousing and gambling. They say he winning big and cleaning all them white folks out they money. But I ain't in no condition to look him up, Spencer. I figure it best I get back here and let Leroy and the rest of y'all know." Mr. Highgate started talking in that surprised little voice again. He said, "He done try to blow my head off, Spencer. He done try to kill me to steal Leroy's money." I knowed better. I knowed if the preacher had aimed to blow Mr. Highgate's head off, he'd have blowed it clean off. I knowed the preacher warn't looking to kill him. Pa said, "Don't the woe never end? How much is we 'spected to bear? How much?" Mr. Highgate said, "You gonna have to bring Leroy to me so's I could tell him what happened." Pa said, "Nah, Theodore, you done everything you could. I'ma tell him." He looked at me and said, "Come on, son. We's gonna have to go down to Mrs. Holton's and let Leroy know about this calamity." Me and Pa jumped out of the wagon and started walking toward Mrs. Holton's land. I ain't never seen Pa's head hang so low. I knowed better than to say nothing. Then out of the blue something came to me. This whole mess warn't no one's fault but my own. If I hadn't have told Mr. Leroy that the preacher warn't going to steal his money, none of this would have happened. If I'd have listened to what Pa told me and hadn't stuck my nose in grown folks' business, it wouldn't have happened at all. You'd think I'd have come clean and told Pa, but the way he was looking, I think it would have killed him to know his own big mouth flesh and blood was the cause of all this grieving. We both walked and hung our heads low as the belly on a fat snake and didn't talk about nothing. We saw Mr. Leroy from about a half-mile off. There weren't much you could see, really, excepting for the sun flashing off the axe when he swung it. When we were close enough to see the sweat flying and hear all the music, Pa called out, "Leroy!" Mr. Leroy took one more swing and left the axe biting in that tree. He looked at us, and didn't know words need to be exchanged. He squosed his eyes shut for a second, let out a long breath, sat down, and said, "What? What now?" Pa walked right on up to him and said, "Zeph done run off with the money, Leroy. He shot Theodore, then left him for dead." Mr. Leroy said, "Theodore's dead?" Pa said, "No, he been shot, but it don't look too bad." "The money's gone, Leroy. Zeph's gambling it away up in Michigan." Mr. Leroy didn't say nothing. Then the most terrific thing happened. Mr. Leroy showed his teeth like a madman and snatched that axe out of the oak and raised it over his head. I knowed he'd figured out who'd started this and was going to split me clean in two. This time my legs didn't get soft and loosety. They got strong. Before he could bring that axe down, me and Mr. Leroy both screamed, and I lit out for the woods. I looked back, and Mr. Leroy flung to that axe toward one of the oaks on Mrs. Holton's land. It hit about 30 feet up and stuck there. Then he cut off into the woods in the other direction. I figured he was going to circle round to catch me, so I ran deeper into the woods fast as I could. I was running so hard, it seemed like the trees started stepping aside, like they knowed if I hit 'em they'd get knocked clean over. I was running like the wind. I didn't feel nor hear nothing 'cept my heart. It seemed like it jumped right out of my chest and came to rest twixt my ears. Close as the branches on the trees were slapping by me, I knowed they had to be giving me some pretty good whoopings, but I didn't feel nothing. All I was worrying about was getting away before Mr. Leroy could bring me down with his axe. All I was thinking about was running faster than anybody'd ever run afore. I must have run for an hour. I was going fast, all right, but it warn't fast enough. All of a sudden there was a hand round my collar, and I was getting snatched right off my feet from behind and pulled down. I hit the ground so hard and sudden that my mouth came open and I swallowed a bunch of dirt and old dead leaves. I hoped Mr. Leroy didn't tarry when he cut me in two. I hoped I didn't get the chance to do too much screaming and begging. I put my hands over my eyes and waited to get killed. Okay, that's the end of chapter 17. So you're going to have to wait until tomorrow to find out what happens to Elijah. That's terrible. Well, I guess we found out that the preacher wasn't to be trusted, right? And Elijah, even though he wanted to think well of somebody, that wasn't the case. Why do you think the preacher would have done something like that? I don't know. Maybe we'll find out a little bit more tomorrow. Hope you can join me then. Bye.